This is one of my favorite items to talk about from any Civil War battle. This is something that is really not studied all that much. There are a handful of historians who really dive into the street fighting at Fredericksburg, but it's an important aspect of the December 1862 battle. This will actually precede the battles at Slaughter Pen Farm, Prospect Hill, and Marie's Heights that took place on December 13th of 1862. Now, this battle will take place on December the 11th, and this will be the Union Army trying to cross the Rappahannock River, establish a bridgehead, and then push into the city of Fredericksburg, as well as the plain south of Fredericksburg, so that they can deploy their army. And we'll get into that here in just a few minutes. And this is also one that we spend a lot of time with the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, providing staff rides. I was just out there last year with a group of engineers from the Marines. Year before, I did the same thing, talking about the different aspects of this campaign, but specifically focusing on the logistics as well as the river crossing and how that's going to play into some of our larger story. So to get to where we need to be, and that'll be in Fredericksburg, let's take a quick look at what the street fighting may have looked like in December of 1862. This is a painting by Don Troiani. It's called Fire on Caroline Street. Caroline Street is essentially Main Street in Fredericksburg, where you see the dry goods store there. That is Caroline Street, running roughly north to south through the city of Fredericksburg. This is the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, known as the Bloody 20th at the time of the war. Today we call it the Harvard Regiment. They are pushing their way into Fredericksburg, and they are in what we consider urban combat with Mississippians from William Barksdale's 4 regiments, his Mississippi Brigade of James Longstreet's 1st Army Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. So what you're seeing here is Troiani's rendition of what this may have looked like in December of 1862. Now, there are some things to note here. We can see that the clapboard houses of Fredericksburg are shredded by small arms fire as well as artillery fire. That is going to play into our story. We'll see that the 20th is charging into town wearing their greatcoats. Greatcoats are the heavy coats that these guys would wear during the winter. They're great coats to wear during the winter, but they do make it harder to maneuver. And Fredericksburg has this misconception that it was always cold during this campaign. The reality is, during the day, it's going to be about 56 degrees during the day, but at night, it will fall below freezing. And the day we're going to talk about, December the 11th, 1862, on the evening or that very early morning hours of December the 11th, it'll be about 24 degrees. And then the temperature will top out at about 56 degrees. So would they be wearing all these gray coats? Maybe, because remember, the infantry have to carry everything with them. They either have to wear it, or they have to put it in a backpack, or they have to throw it off to the side of the road. So they may have been wearing gray coats at the time. Hard to tell exactly what they all would have had, but that is always the misnomer with Fredericksburg, that every Union soldier is going to be wearing these great coats as they attack across the open attack plains or here into the city. But this is a great rendition of what we're going to talk about to set the stage for this December 11th, 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg. Now, to get to Fredericksburg, we have to jump back a little bit. Let's go from the 50,000 feet down to the 500 feet. In the days after the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln is going to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. That's on September 22nd. He will do this. This is going to start changing the war aims for the North. Remember, if we're going to talk about the military side of things, everything goes from politics down to strategy, down to the operational level, down to the tactical level of warfare. And that's how you have to unpack these campaigns of the American Civil War. And Fredericksburg, perhaps, is the most impacted campaign whenever it comes to politics. Fredericksburg will come in the wake of the midterm elections, just a few weeks after the midterm elections, which don't go well for the Republican Party. Normally, the sitting party, or the party in power in the United States, does not do well during the midterm elections, and that will hold true here in 1862. You have the Emancipation Proclamation issued after the Battle of Antietam. So that's going to play into the political side of things. And when Lincoln is going to sign it on January 1st of 1863, he wants to bolster this proclamation. He also wants to maybe show that the to the north that the war effort's going better than the voters thought at the polls. So he is going to send 3 armies into the South during December of 1862. Things are not going to go well for Lincoln, just to pull back that curtain. One army will come to woe on the banks of the Rappahannock River. That's who we'll talk about with the Union Army of the Potomac. One army will head down towards Vicksburg, Mississippi. Things won't go well there at a place called Chickasaw Bayou. The only Union victory will take place at Stones River, also called Murfreesboro. That January 1862-63 victory will be the only bright spot in an otherwise bleak winter for Abraham Lincoln. And that army, the Army of the Cumberland, is so battered that it cannot wage war for the next 6 months. So things aren't going to go well for Lincoln, really, in the days after the Battle of Antietam. In the wake of Antietam, we're going to have a command change. On November 6th and 7th, we're going to have our elections through the North. And on the 7th, we are going to replace George McClellan. McClellan's the Army of the Potomac, the principal Union Army's commander in the Eastern Theater. McClellan had built the army. He had put together a fine military machine, but he is not the man to lead it. And Lincoln had come to this conclusion a while back. So after the midterm elections and after McClellan really does not follow up his victory at Antietam, Lincoln is going to decide to go somewhere else. And he's going to go with a new commander named Ambrose Burnside, who I'll show you here in a second. But this is McClellan's going away party. It's a big, somewhat of a party for McClellan over 3 days from November 7th through November the 10th. He's going to have banquets. His men are going to come in and greet him. And then there's going to be a review of the army, and McClellan is going to leave the Army of the Potomac for what he does not think is the last time, but for what we know today is the last time. And Little Mac will come back to haunt Abraham Lincoln in 1864 in another way. But why are we going to go into this winter campaign? As I mentioned, Lincoln wants to bring home as many victories as possible before January 1st of 1863. So he's going to turn to a new commander. The man in the middle you see here with the awesome sideburns, that is Ambrose Everett Burnside. He's a 38-year-old Indiana native, West Point graduate of the class of 1847, and he is Lincoln's man to take over for George McClellan. But Burnside doesn't want the job. 3 times he tries to turn down the Army of the Potomac's job, and 3 times Lincoln's going to be rebuked. Finally, he's going to come to Burnside and say, hey, if you don't take this command, I'm going to give it to Joe Hooker. Joe Hooker is the arch nemesis of Ambrose Burnside. So Burnside reluctantly says, yes, I will take command of the largest army on this continent to date. Now think about that for a second. You have Ambrose Burnside, who's going to take over an army reluctantly. And how do you coerce him into taking over this army? You're going to tell him, hey, your rival will get this. This is not exactly going to instill confidence in anyone. What also won't instill confidence in many people is the fact that Burnside is going to flat out say, I'm not the right guy for this job. By all accounts, Ambrose Burnside's a really good guy. Most people really like him. He's very affable. You want to sit down, talk with him, maybe have a coffee with him, but you probably don't want to follow him into battle. He does have high points, but more low points during the Civil War. He will be the shortest tenured commander of the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln's principal army in the Eastern Theater, at a mere 77 days. Now, off to the right of the screen, you're going to see a guy named Henry Halleck. He's nicknamed Old Brains. It's a kind of a derisive nickname. He's a West Point graduate of the class of 1839. And Halleck is an interesting character, to say the least. Lincoln's going to figure out very quickly that he is nothing more than a first-rate clerk. That's what he's going to call him. Now, Halleck, he's into logistics, ironically. I pulled his papers at the Library of Congress a few years back, and I'm reading through it. And while most people are trying to emulate Napoleon during the Civil War, they're talking about his battles at Jena, Austerlitz, and other places. Henry Halleck is actually reading the logistical breakdown and studying the logistical breakdown of Napoleon's army. So you would think he'd be pretty good at moving something from point A to point B to point C. That's not going to be the case. And Abraham Lincoln is going to not have a really good winter. Let's put it that way. So why Fredericksburg? This is a picture of Fredericksburg taken in early 1863. It's a great panoramic photograph. There's a series of photographs taken up and down the Rappahannock River. That's the river you see in the foreground. The Rappahannock River flows past the sleepy city of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and it's a pretty backwater burg, according to some people. Just to read you a quote, this comes from the Prince of Wales, who visited at one time. He said, "The town is one of those rare spots solely to be found so far as the North American continent is concerned, in the southern states and chiefly in Virginia, which has hardly had a building added to it for 50 years. It has long boasted itself as possessing a refined society, which may be interpreted as a society satisfied with the possession of a moderate competency, unambitious, devoid of Yankee restlessness and greed." It's a way the London Times is going to be insulting the city of Fredericksburg. But the Fredericksburg in 1862 was a city that was on the rise. It had gaslit streets, it has sidewalks, it has a canal system that runs through it. You can actually see over here one of our mills. The sluiceway is actually going on here. It's flowing out into the river when this picture was taken. It had a railroad running through here. You can see what the remnants were of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad Bridge. The railroad does exactly what its name implies. It runs from Richmond, 55 miles north to Fredericksburg, and then another 15 miles north to the Potomac River where it terminates. So this was a railroad that ran through here. The city has 13 confectionaries, so they had quite a sweet tooth while they're there. And then they also have a new city hall that was completed in the late 1850s. I think 1858 is City Hall here. We have a Presbyterian church. We have St. George's Episcopal Church. We have a Baptist church. We have a Methodist church. We have 2 newspapers in the town. So this is it is a fairly well-to-do city. In the colonial days, George Washington's sister lived here, as did his mother, Mary Ball Washington. She'll spend the last 17 years of her life here. Hugh Mercer, who we talked about earlier with Mark Malloy in his talk about Princeton. Hugh Mercer lived here and had a apothecary shop down on Caroline Street. George Whedon, who's another hero of the Revolution for the Patriot cause, he lives just off the left of this picture. So it's a pretty interesting town. There were about 5,020 people living here at the time in 1860, at the time of the 1860 census. The time of the Battle of Fredericksburg, the numbers are going to have dropped for 2 reasons. Number one, the Union Army will occupy Fredericksburg in April through August of 1862. When they arrive here in April, it's actually a pretty cool story. The 2nd New York Cav will try to ride across a bridge that is no longer here, because the Confederates are trying to burn it. They can't take the bridge, so they turn around, they grab some of the United States sharpshooters, who at this time are carrying Colt repeating rifles, put those guys on the backs with the horsemen, and they charge back across the bridge and start firing like an old West, Wild West show. It had to be a sight to see. But Fredericksburg will fall. The Confederates had burned all 3 bridges into the city in April of 1862. So by the time Ambrose Burnside decides to come here in November of 1862, he is well aware, as is the Union Army, that there are no bridges spanning the Rappahannock River, which at this spot where this picture is taken is about 420 feet wide. So why would we come to Fredericksburg anyways, if we're Ambrose Burnside? Why would we come down here? Fredericksburg sits, as we can see here, about, pull out my handy dandy pointer here, if I can get that. There we go. Fredericksburg sits here, roughly halfway between Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy, 55 miles to the south. You could take the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad north up to Fredericksburg. It'll terminate up here at Aquia Creek on the Potomac River. And then 50 miles north of Fredericksburg is Washington, D.C., the United States capital. So why is Fredericksburg so important? Simply because it sits between the 2 opposing wartime capitals. Burnside, when he looks at his map, is going to notice a few items. One of them I outlined, and that's the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. He could potentially supply his army using the RF&P. He also can maybe use the Potomac River as well as to establish a supply base up at Aquia Landing. He can also potentially use the Rappahannock River and bringing supplies up from this direction. And he can use two roads. One of them shown on here, the Telegraph Road, which is modern day Route 1, heading south down to Richmond. And he can use another road known as the Richmond Highway, the Bowling Green Road, the Road to Richmond, all kinds of different names. Modern day Route 2 and 17 coming out of Fredericksburg. So he can move his army on two parallel routes to Richmond. He can supply it using water as well as rail, and he can keep pressing south towards Richmond. Because when Abraham Lincoln charges him with the Army of the Potomac's command, it's not so much to take Richmond. If he takes Richmond, that's great. What Lincoln really needs is a victory before January 1st of 1862. So what's the fastest way to draw out a Union or a Confederate army? You threaten their capitals. If you threaten the politicians are going to cry wolf, and they're going to ask for their armies to come out and to protect them. So that is Burnside's idea. Burnside's army is actually massed around Warrenton, Virginia, between 35 and 40 miles away from Fredericksburg. What Burnside intends to do, and I'll show you another map here in a moment, is to move his army down here to Fredericksburg, seize the city, seize the RFMP, and seize the two roads and keep moving south. He does not intend to fight here. He intends to interpose himself between Robert E. Lee's army, which is amassed out in Culpeper, Virginia, one half of it, and the other half is up off of our map up near Winchester, Virginia. So what Burnside wants to do is establish a defensive line between Richmond and Lee's army and force Lee to come down and to attack him. It's not a bad plan on paper, to be quite frank. It's the execution of it from top to bottom that is utterly flawed. So let's move on to our next slide here. And let me clear that off for us. All my drawings, there we go. So this is what Fredericksburg will look like in 1860, roughly 1857. We have the open fields that most people know heading out towards Marie's Heights. This is the Marie's Heights out in this direction. The Marie family home of Brompton, built around 1824, sitting on top of Marie's Heights, which is simply a series of 5 hills on the western side of the city of Fredericksburg. This view is taken from Stafford Heights, or drawn from Stafford Heights, which is in Stafford County, Virginia. You can see the RFMP Bridge actually intact here. You can see the Chatham Bridge, also known as the William Street Bridge here. And then we have another bridge, which would have been just off of our map here, the Falmouth Bridge. So there were 3 bridges. All of them have been destroyed by Confederates. Now, Fredericksburg is a busy port prior to the war. You can see the ships down here. This is the first navigable port on the Rappahannock, or the last, depending on which way you come up and down the river, because the fall line of the Rappahannock is up here, off to the top right of our map. There's a monument to Mary Ball Washington out here. And then we have our open fields, and you can see the city, which is about 5 blocks deep on average during the Civil War. It also spans a riverfront of about 1¼ miles in 1862. One Union soldier, and if you're wondering what I'm doing, because I have to share my screen, I have to use my phone to read some of my quotes for you. One Union soldier, David Chamberlain of the 4th Michigan, wrote after the battle that the city of Fredericksburg was an aristocratic and wealthy town. There was more taste and comfort exhibited in the dwelling than any place I have ever seen south of the northern cities. The town was lighted with gas and well supplied with good water. The streets and sidewalks are in good order. The general location is superb. A valley about 2 miles wide, gradually rising up until you reach a first range of hills, then running off into a country beautifully rolling. So this is the valley he's talking about here. This is the Rappahannock River Valley. The range of hills he's talking about are the far range of hills at the top here. That's Marie's Heights, leading out into a country beautifully rolling. The Union and Confederate armies aren't going to think that in 1863 and 64 when they come back here to fight at Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. But for now, they seem to be much prettier than what happened at Fredericksburg. So let's move forward here and bring our armies down to Fredericksburg. And so this is a map showing you what's going to happen here. To make a very long story short, Burnside is going to get the approval to move to Fredericksburg. He is going to pitch the idea to Lincoln as well as to Halleck. 2 of them are going to give him the green light. And Burnside is going to ask Henry Halleck to have temporary bridges awaiting him at Fredericksburg. This is a key component of our story we'll talk about in a minute. Burnside wants to move his mammoth 123,000-man army from the area around Warrenton, Virginia, down to Fredericksburg, and then cross south of the Rappahannock River, as I pointed out earlier. So Burnside decides on November 15th, he starts to march, and by the 17th, he has covered the 40 or so miles between Warrenton and Fredericksburg. There was a driving rainstorm, a driving snowstorm. The roads had turned into mud, but still the Union Army had arrived at Fredericksburg, and they caught Robert E. Lee completely off guard. Lee, at this point, the Confederate Army of the Northern Virginia commander, the principal army in the Eastern Theater for the Confederacy, has decided he doesn't want to fight at Fredericksburg either. He writes to his president, Jefferson Davis, and says, hey, I don't want to fight at Fredericksburg. I'm going to pull back off the bottom of this map that you see here. He's going to pull back to a river made famous in 1864 called the North Anna River. He wants to establish a defensive line there, and then he is going to allow Burnside to come down and to attack him. Davis says, absolutely not. I want to keep as much distance between me and the Union Army and Richmond as possible. So Lee is going to shift his army, starting with James Longstreet, his second in command, 40,000 men from Culpeper Courthouse, about 35 miles to the west of Fredericksburg, bring them into Fredericksburg, and then he will call into the Shenandoah Valley and bring in the Second Corps, about 38,000 men commanded by Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, come down into Newmarket, cut across Orange, and make his way down to Fredericksburg. Now, you would think that the Confederates would lose this race. Burnside has amassed 123,000 men on the north bank of the Rappahannock River. He's looking at Fredericksburg. There's less than 1,000 Confederates, home guards in the city. Things seem to be going well, but they're not, because good old Army bureaucracy is going to screw everything up for poor Ambrose Burnside. Burnside is awaiting what we call pontoon bridges. Technically, they're ponton bridges. There should be only one O in the name pontoon. That's the French and German spelling, but the American spelling has two O's. Pontoon bridges, as you see here on the right-hand side, that's a historic photo showing what a pontoon bridge on a wagon, a special wagon, to carry it across roads would look like. This is a 1,600-pound boat that is not meant for speed. It is built for buoyancy. You would take this boat, place it in the water, and you would turn it sideways, anchoring it down. You place a few more boats parallel to it and sideways, anchoring them down as well. And then you put runners and then wood planking right across the top of this bridge. It's a temporary bridge. These date all the way back to the time of Julius Caesar. On the left-hand side, you can see me as many moons ago as a Park Service ranger, standing in front of a 3/4 scale pontoon bridge at a place called Chatham, which we'll talk about in a second. And if you see over top of my right hand, you will see a red-topped house, and you will also see some open land here. That will be one of the pontoon crossing sites here at Fredericksburg. So this is what the pontoon bridge, a completed one, would look like behind me. You'll notice ropes lashing it down. The average size of rope that they'll use is about 3-inch. The boats themselves are about 1,600 pounds. I mean, these things are big, they're unwieldy. They're not meant to move men across a river, which they're eventually going to do here at Fredericksburg. So this is what a pontoon train would look like. This is meaning a pontoon train, meaning the wagon train of pontoons that would bring you down to bring it to the front. And this is what a completed bridge would look like. This is taken just south of Fredericksburg at a place called the Bend. This is a picture taken in 1863, looking at a completed bridge. The bridges themselves, the engineers, which are specialized construction troops, could put up one of these bridges in a matter of hours. This bridge that you're looking at here, these two bridges, are 440 feet long. They are very impressive. They can carry across artillery, heavy wagons, men, material, anything you need can come across these bridges. When you march across a bridge, especially in the time of the Civil War, you never march in step, meaning you don't march with everyone marching at the same beat. You come across this bridge at what's called the route step, just anyone walking, kind of shuffling across. Because if you come across in the same time, you could potentially shatter the bridge. You could actually break the bridges that way. So this is what it would look like. We don't use nails. We use rope to put them together. And the reason we use rope is so you can chop them and float the bridges away. Now, due to Army bureaucracy, as I mentioned, these bridges do not arrive because Henry Halleck, who promised Burnside his bridges, takes a few days to cut the orders. And then it takes another 10 days to get these things down to Fredericksburg. And in those 10 days, the Confederates are going to start to arrive. Whenever they do send these bridges forward, they try to strap them together and float them down the river, which they hit a sandbar. Then they get 400 unbroken mules and try to pull them with 400 unbroken mules. If you've ever dealt with a horse and think they're stubborn, deal with a mule. They're 10 times as stubborn. So Burnside's stuck on the banks of the Rappahannock River. He is going to sit there. Confederates will take pot shots at him, some of the home guard. He doesn't know where Robert E. Lee's army is. Burnside does have the option of moving up or down the river. He does not want to do this because he needs to make a military crossing. He needs to make sure that he does not get cut off. One half of his army on one side of the river, one half on the other side. He has to supply his army. He has to keep the campaign moving. And remember, it's coming on winter. It's going to rain. It's going to snow. The level of the river may rise. The Rappahannock's a tidal river anyways. It's a mess for Ambrose Burnside in many ways. So these pesky home guard troops in Fredericksburg are going to sit on the banks of the Rappahannock River, kind of heckling the Union soldiers. They'll be firing upon them. And so Burnside eventually finds a small rowboat and sends the man on the left-hand side across. His name is Marsina Patrick. He is remembered by one man as the greatest living fossil of the Cenozoic era. So that's going to tell you all you need to know about Marsina Patrick. He's a crusty old guy. Marsina Patrick goes across the river and meets with the man on the right-hand side of your screen, and that's Montgomery Slaughter, the aptly named mayor of Fredericksburg. Slaughter is going to meet with Marsina Patrick. The two of them are going to talk about what's going to happen, and Marsina says, you stop firing on our soldiers, or we're going to bombard your city, or we're going to send Union troops across, and we're going to completely root you Confederates out. Slaughter's shaken, goes back to the town fathers, tells them all about this. But as he's meeting with the town fathers, up comes some staff officers of James Longstreet's Confederate First Corps. 40,000 Confederates have arrived. When Slaughter goes back to meet with Marsina Patrick, all of a sudden he has a backbone. Slaughter does. And Marsina figures something's up. And he is going to be taken blindfolded to Confederate headquarters, where he is going to meet with some of Longstreet's men. And he realizes the jig is up. Patrick's blustering isn't going to do anything. But they sit down and they have a meeting. And it's important to remember that they have this meeting. And that is that both sides agree not to use the city of Fredericksburg for military purposes. There's perhaps 1,000 people living in Fredericksburg. This was the front line of war throughout much of April and August of 1862. So many of the civilians had fled. Many of the slave population who lived in Fredericksburg is about one half free, one half slave, half white, half black. Many of them had gone to the Union Army. Many of the slaves self-emancipated themselves. So we're not 100% sure how many people were actually in Fredericksburg at the time. We do know what the census says from 1860, but we estimate there's about 1,000 people in Fredericksburg by the time the two armies start squaring off against one another. Many of these civilians will actually flee, who are left, to the west towards the Chancellorsville battlefield. But the two sides decide that they are not going to use the city for military purposes. And almost immediately, the Confederates break this truce or this agreement, and they start sending an entire brigade of Mississippians down into the city itself. These are 1,500 or so Mississippians commanded by the fiery William Barksdale, 41 years old, Tennessee native. He's a lawyer. He's a former politician. He is a firebrand secessionist. And William Barksdale is not a West Point graduate. In fact, most of his officers are not West Point graduates, which actually, when I take staff rides out onto the battlefield, talk a lot about, because these guys aren't technically trained in the ways of the arts of war. They're going to be more apt to think outside the box. And that's exactly what William Barksdale's men are going to do. I showed this slide here, and you see the Confederates. They are going to be behind barrels. They're going to be in houses. They're in a cityscape. So what Barksdale's going to do is actually put his men down in the city. He's going to break them up into what we would consider today sniper teams. We're not talking actual snipers. We're talking about just typical infantry, but we would consider them sniper teams today. 2 to 20 men per building. Some of the men will be in the warehouses, some will be in factories, some will be in homes. Others will be behind barrels like you see here. Some will go behind fences and actually cut holes in the fences so that they can't be seen, but they can fire through these portals. Barksdale will cut entrenchments or rifle pits in people's backyards. Barksdale is going to set up a very sophisticated, what we call defense in depth. And the center of his defense will be anchored around a plateau in the center of the city along Princess Anne Street. This is his headquarters in 1862. It's today the Fredericksburg Area Museum, but this was the market house. It was the town hall constructed in 1816. You can actually see back here the meat hooks whenever they would come out and meet for their market day, and this is where they would hang their meat and other things. So it's a really interesting building that is still there today along Princess Anne Street. And I should mention, Fredericksburg is not named after Frederick the Great, like a lot of people think. It's actually named after the son of King George II, Prince Frederick. And the House of Hanover, who the King George is part of, that's where we're going to get Hanover Street from the House of Hanover. Sophia Street, Charlotte Street, George Street, Frederick Street, they'll be named after the princes, the princesses, and the king himself, named after King George II's family. And this is what Barksdale is going to set up here in the city. As I mentioned, his headquarters will be roughly in the center of the city. This is here at the Market House. St. George's Episcopal Church is just below it. He is going to set up men down at the bottom of our map. He'll put them down at a ferry crossing known as Ferry Farm. This is where George Washington's family actually ran a ferry in the days before the American Revolution. It's down here, what is called the middle pontoon crossing. Up here at the upper pontoon crossing, which we'll talk about in a moment, he is going to set up more men. He is going to, again, break his brigade of 1,500 men up, not into entire regiments. What you're seeing are pieces of regiments spread out through the city, but he is going to put up what we would consider resistance points. And he is going to put up his first line of resistance along Water Street, also called Sophia Street. We have our second line of resistance along Caroline Street, which is essentially Main Street. And our third line of resistance will be here along Princess Anne Street. Once these three lines of resistance fall, Barksdale will fall back towards Murray's Heights off in this direction and towards the Confederate Army. Now, Barksdale will be challenged by Robert E. Lee to do two things. Number one, he wants to get the Union Army to commit here to fight at Fredericksburg. His job, Barksdale's, is to tell Lee and the rest of the army when Burnside is crossing at Fredericksburg, if he decides to cross here. The second job he will have is to delay the Union Army for as long as possible. If you're William Barksdale and you're the 1,500 Mississippians in Fredericksburg, you think you're in a pretty good position. You're in a cityscape. You have a lot of cover and concealment. You have high esprit de corps because you guys feel pretty good about yourselves throughout the war so far. But you're stuck between two massive armies, 78,000 Confederates to your rear, 123,000 angry Yankees to your front. And to get back to your friendly lines, you have to cross nearly 900 yards of wide open fields when you break out of the city. And that can be dominated by the 183 cannon that will eventually be placed on Stafford Heights by the Union Army over here. So if you're Barksdale, you might feel pretty good. You might not, depending on what point of the battle it is. So let's move forward here. The Union Army is going to decide after a lot of the civilians flee out to the area called Salem Church. This is the Salem Church here on the left-hand side, constructed in 1844. These are Union veterans outside of it. There's a battle that took place there in May of 1863. This is where a lot of the civilian population will flee to in 1862. The building is still here. This is administered by the National Park Service. There's a larger, newer Salem Church out here just adjacent to this, the historic Salem Church. You can actually see the old slave gallery door here, the old gallery door for the free whites to go into. The slave gallery is still in here. We have bullet holes in here. Mary Todd Lincoln's brother, who's serving in the Confederate Army with the 3rd South Carolina as a doctor, serves here in May of 1863, calls his sister a crack brain fool, I believe, or something like that. He's not a big fan of his sister at that point. But this is what Salem Church would look like, and outside of it, you would see a lot of the civilians of Fredericksburg flee. Now, as I mentioned, Union Army arrives here on November 17th. They're not going to do battle until December the 11th. Some of these civilians come back into town. So again, we don't know how many civilians might be caught in the crossfire at Fredericksburg because they figured there's not going to be a battle here. It's taking this long. So what Ambrose Burnside is going to do very quickly to bring it all together, he's going to decide to cross the river here at Fredericksburg. Why? Because, according to him, it's going to surprise the enemy as much as crossing anywhere else. If he goes up the river, he could potentially cross at a place called Banks's Ford. But the Confederates can block that route. If he goes downriver, he can cross at a place called Port Royal. That's a place where John Wilkes Booth is going to be cornered, killed, and captured in 1865. But the river widens dramatically down there, and he's going to need long pontoon bridges, and the Confederates can move down that way as the Union Army does that, or as the Union Army skirts along the river. So Burnside's justification for attacking here at Fredericksburg is basically, to read between the lines, it is so stupid to attack here at Fredericksburg that the Confederates won't think it's coming. That's what he's going to tell Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln is going to be like, all right, that's cool. Let's try it. Honest to God, that's how it's going to happen here. Burnside decides to place bridges at 3 different spots to cross into Fredericksburg. His ideal timetable is to cross on the 11th, deploy most of his army on the afternoon of the 11th, and make assaults on the 12th. Not going to happen. At 3 different places, the upper crossing, the middle crossing, the lower crossing. Army doesn't overthink it. They are going to place 6 bridges eventually, and they are going to try to cross around 123,000 men for the Fredericksburg campaign. Not all 123,000 will come across into Fredericksburg, about 90,000 do. So the men charged with trying to lay these bridges, those bridges that I showed you are 2 of the men here. On the left-hand side, you have Wesley Brainerd, who is going to oversee one of the bridges at the upper pontoon crossing. The upper pontoon crossing is what you see here. This is a monument to the 7th Michigan Infantry, who will press across the river. And on the right-hand side of this screen is Daniel Woodbury. Daniel Woodbury is the scapegoat for the Fredericksburg campaign. He is in charge of the engineers. Woodbury, after the Battle of Fredericksburg, after the debacle at Fredericksburg, will be stranded in Dry Tortuga, where he is in charge of basically the Key West and absolutely nothing. Sadly, he is going to contract yellow fever while he's down there and die while he's in Florida. But he will become the scapegoat. He's the man who's overseeing the bridging operations along the Rappahannock River. Around anywhere between 8 and 11 p.m. on the evening of December the 10th, the engineers will start to move their bridging materials down to the riverfront at 3 different points. This is known as the upper pontoon crossing. This will come across at a place called Hawk Street, the foot of Hawk Street. And I'll show you a map here shortly. And this is what an artist's rendition looks like whenever the Confederates towards the top of the screen start to fire on these men who are out in the river. Wesley Brainerd is not very happy about what he sees. He says, when we then rode out to the riverbank, all was quiet, peaceful, and calm on the evening of December 10th in the morning of December the 11th. Who would have dreamed that a terrible tragedy was soon to be enacted there? The moon shone with a quiet light which reflected from the sparkling snow which scarcely covered the ground. Reflections from little campfires here and there on the opposite side of the river glimmered and sparkled from the ice which bordered the stream. On our side of the stream, everything was quiet, as if no enemy or army had an existence. He's going to talk about putting his men out onto the riverfront. He's going to start building a bridge that will eventually span about 400 feet of the river. His men will start to work probably around 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't believe their watches because they don't have standardized time as we know today. They have to wind their watches. Not everyone's going to wind their watch. So their concept of time is a little bit different than ours. But what ends up happening is William Barksdale and his Mississippians are all over this city. Even if you can't see them, they can see what's happening out on this full moonlit river. They can see what's going on. They can hear what's going on. And Barksdale, he's not going to immediately fire on these Union soldiers. He's going to lure them in. This is what Robert E. Lee wanted. Lee wanted to lure in the Union forces, make them commit. So the Union engineers start building these bridges, and they work feverishly to build these bridges. And by sometime around 4 to 5 o'clock in the morning, the bridges are about halfway into the river. And at that point, 2 cannon fire. They're Confederate cannon. They're about 1.75 miles away. They're not aimed at these engineers. They can't see the engineers. But what they do is they tell the entire Confederate army that Burnside is crossing at Fredericksburg and for everyone to consolidate here. This is where the crossing will take place. Now, Barksdale, his next job comes up. He's told Robert E. Lee that the Union Army is crossing here. Now his second job comes up, and that is to delay the Union Army as long as possible. Wesley Brainerd, the Union engineer, said, "Soon the bell sounded the hour of 4. In an instant, we are in the midst of a perfect storm of bullets. Our artillery on the crest of the hill in the rear of us quickly responded, their shells soaring and screeching over our heads. Our infantry on the right and our left fired also. The battle was now fairly open. The enemy rained upon my bridge. They went, the bullets, they went whizzing and spitting by me, around me, pattering on the bridge, splashing into the water. Where were my men? They did not require any command to fall back in good order, for had any such order been given, not a word of it could have been heard in that pandemonium. Everyone started for the shore end of the bridge. Some fell into the boats dead. Some fell into the stream and on to the bridge dead. Some wounded crawled along on their hands and knees. And in a few moments, all of us were off the bridge, all except the dead." What ends up happening is Barksdale's men, who were ensconced in the city, open fire on these engineers who are on flat boats, on a flat bridge without weapons. They're just going to be perfect targets. One Union soldier watching from the banks of the Rappahannock said that in the first volley, 2 officers fell dead and 19 men fell wounded on the first bridge that they saw. The Union engineers scurry off the bridge, as Brainerd said. They hide for a while, and the Confederates will stop firing. After a while, out will creep the Union engineers. Out will come the Confederates, and they'll fire on the Union soldiers again. And this cat and mouse game goes on throughout the morning. So Burnside becomes absolutely infuriated at what's happening on his bridge. You know, the motto of the U.S. engineers is essayons, and that is let us try. I mean, I'm not sure they wanted to be trying here today. This is an artist's rendition of what it looked like. You can see the white pine boats being shot up left and right. You can see the men trying to duck for cover as the sun's rising here in Fredericksburg. So Burnside becomes infuriated. He starts to scream that his men are being held by the throat by a handful of sharpshooters. So he turns to Henry Hunt, the man here on the left, Henry Jackson Hunt, is in charge of the Union artillery here at Fredericksburg, and Hunt is going to open on the city with 147 and then eventually 183 cannon. He's going to bombard the city. Now, Hunt is going to tell his men to fire once every 3 minutes for a few reasons. Number one, he wants to let the smoke rise off the battlefield because it is a cool day. The smoke from the gunpowder is hanging low, so he wants them to clear off. Second, he thought that they were wasting ammunition at the Battle of Antietam. It cost the U.S. government $2.62 every time they fired a cannon, so he wanted to save the taxpayers' money. So he wanted them to check their fire as much as possible. So Hunt's men will open fire. Now, you would think that the engineers would crawl out and start to actually work under this bombardment, this barrage. Barrage means barrier. That's what barrage means. So the Union artillery is setting up a barrier for them. This is used extensively during World War I. But the problem during the American Civil War is we're not using fully encased ammunition. And it's getting warm during the day, cold at night. It's damp out. The powder is now being temperamental, and many of the rounds are exploding prematurely, and they were hitting the men down along the riverbanks. So you couldn't be out underneath there without the problem of maybe having friendly fire take place. So bombardment will take place. Then, after a while, bombardment stops, out creep the engineers, out come the Confederates. That didn't work. What are we going to do? One artillerist said that trying to kill a sharpshooter with an artillery piece was like trying to kill a fly with a pistol, and it just didn't work. Add to it, many of the homes in Fredericksburg are clapboard. These clapboard homes are very thin, so the Union artillery shells will just punch holes right through them. The impact shells will not explode. And then solid shot will rip right through them. And all they do is create a new firing portal for the Confederates. It's a ready-made place to fight from. Eventually, the city starts to catch fire. The artillery is firing over 100 rounds per minute into the city, according to one man. There's another Third Corps artillerist who's going to claim that he watched a Watched a battery commander trying to fire at one of the steeples every time the bell rang on, I think, St. George's Church, and he never did hit that bell. So that's showing you the accuracy of the fire there. He can't hit a big old steeple. How do you expect him to hit actually a person? So Burnside needs a new idea, and it comes from Henry Hunt. He says, we have boats and we have infantry. Why don't we put the two together? We'll ferry them across the river under fire, and we'll establish a bridgehead that way. Today, that makes sense. When we look back on World War II, we look at the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, we look at D-Day, we look at some other landings, Anzio and other places. It makes perfect sense. But this will be the first time that the United States Army will make a riverine crossing under fire in its history. And this is not easily done. So what will end up happening is the man on the left, Norman Hall, West Point class of 1859, he is going to be tasked with leading his men from his brigade from the Union Second Corps across the river. Now, Hall is going to volunteer his men for this action. I say he's voluntold them what to do. He's going to turn to Henry Baxter, the man you see on the right-hand side here. He's a lieutenant colonel at the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and he's going to tell Baxter he's going to take his 157 men across the river of the 7th Michigan. He's going to put them in boats, and you're going to go across the river. That's how this is going to go down. Most people think of this being a river crossing. The Emanuel Leutze painting at, Washington crossing the Delaware in December of 1776, very regal. This is what he thinks. In reality, it's more like the Geico commercial. That's what it's going to look like when we cross here at the Rappahannock. Sadly, it's going to be a comical scene. It would be more funny if it wasn't half as sad as what's about to happen on the banks of the Rappahannock River. But the Geico scene of Washington crossing the Delaware Turnpike, yeah, that makes sense. This is what the river looks like from the Confederates' vantage point. On the left-hand side, you will see right up along Sophia Street. On the right-hand side, you will see a house in the trees. That's Chatham Manor. That is the headquarters of Edwin Sumner during the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg. There are artillery pieces up along these heights known as Stratford Heights, and these artillery pieces have been bombarding. Nothing seems to be working. So now, down to the riverfront, we'll charge the 7th Michigan over here. As they charge down to the riverfront, they jump into the boats. Out of the boats jump the engineers. They don't want anything to do with this. They're getting out of Dodge. And now the 7th Michigan, who don't really know how to row these boats across, are going to have to force a riverine crossing. As I mentioned, the boats themselves are large 1,600-pound boats. They're not meant to carry men. They're meant to be buoyant to hold up a bridge. They're flat-nosed. So these things are not going to cut through water. These things are going to slowly go through water like a Higgins boat during World War II. So we're going to bring them across. The good thing is, once they do hit land, you can drive them right up onto a shore like a landing craft. The bad thing is, you got to row them across with 8-foot oars. And some of these guys are rowing faster than others. There's talks of boats floating downstream because men aren't rowing hard enough. There's other accounts of men's boats spinning in circles because one side's going faster than another as they row. And the 7th Michigan is finally going to get into this river and start pushing across. As they do, Henry Baxter, their commander, is shot through the chest. He's wounded severely, but not mortally. He's going to turn to his men and say, turn back, turn back. Baxter's second in command, Thomas Hunt, no relation to Henry, is going to say, no, keep going forward. And he gives the order for no quarter. He's going to tell his men not to take prisoners. The 7th Michigan will go about 2/3 the way across the river, receiving casualties. But once they reach about 2/3 the way across the river, the problem with the Confederates is they're not right up on the riverbank. They're actually over where I'm taking this picture from. They're actually in the houses. They can't see the entire riverfront. There's actually a slope behind those signs and the monument you see there. So once they get about 2/3 the way across the river, the Union soldiers are actually very safe from Confederate fire. Boats come up onto shore, out jump the Michiganders, and the Wolverines surge forward, and they start fighting house to house, room by room. You could follow the fighting muzzle flash by muzzle flash, room by room, as these men go and start clearing out the city of Fredericksburg. They're writing a new manual of street fighting. Street fighting is not something the U.S. Army has done very much in its history up until 1862. We did see it during the Battle of Quebec in 1775. We'll see it at Trenton, First Trenton and Second Trenton. We saw it during the Mexico City campaign at Mexico City, as well as Monterey. We'll also see it in the Civil War at places like Cynthiana out in Kentucky and Carthage, Missouri. But they're not trained for this, these Union soldiers, nor are the Confederates. The Confederates are making it up as they go with their defense. The Union is doing the same thing with their assault tactics. These men will push in at the upper crossing, as we see here. We have the Union 7th Michigan comes across first in boats. They'll be followed by the 19th Massachusetts, Captain Henry Weymouth's 19th Massachusetts. They will establish a small bridgehead at the foot of Hawk Street, and they will push up a little bit farther into town, not very far. I'll show you an aerial view here in a moment. The Confederates, on the other hand, are commanded by a 24-year-old, John Pfizer. Pfizer is a Tennessee native, just like William Barksdale, but he's in charge of Mississippians. Pfizer's a fiery guy. At the Battle of Fort Sanders, he decides that he's going to charge at Fort Sanders with a hatchet in his belt, try to climb a Union flagpole to take down the American flag. And as he does so, he's shot through the arm and he's going to lose an arm. But Pfizer is a very aggressive commander. And what we're seeing here is the fact that even though the Confederates are starting to be dislodged along Supply Street, we still have two lines of resistance here. When I'm talking about D-Day, tours there, one thing that the Atlantic Wall lacked, Hitler's Festung Europa, it lacked depth. What Barksdale put up here, he doesn't even know what he's doing. He's not a trained military officer. He set up a defense in depth. And so the 7th Michigan, 19th Massachusetts come into town, and it is a hellacious fight. It is going to be very personal. The bayonet is used freely. At one point, a soldier with the 7th Michigan tries to break open a door, and as he does so, he uses the butt of his musket, and the musket went off and discharged and went through the beard of his lieutenant standing behind him. His lieutenant was none too pleased with that. In another part of town, Confederates set up traps. Some of the 19th Massachusetts busted open a door, only to find that on the other side of the door were waiting Confederate soldiers, and they fired directly into the man who broke open that door, killed him, and wounded several others. The Michiganders and the Bay State boys, when they come across, they don't know exactly what to do. The Mississippians know what to do. They know that they have to delay as long as possible. Now, we're talking it's about 3:30 in the afternoon to 4 o'clock by the time this all plays out. And William Barksdale, who's down at his headquarters here in the center of the city, has dispatched reinforcements to the north side of the city. He's sending them to the south side of the city because there's an assault taking place down there as well. But Barksdale's small unit tactics are working. He's slowing down this Union juggernaut. Now, more Union soldiers, as you'll see here, start to arrive in this bridgehead, and it's not large. After about 45 minutes of fighting, this riverfront is 1.25 miles long. The Union Army only has about 1,100 feet of it secured. So now we have to expand this bridgehead, but no one knows exactly what to do or who's in charge. The 20th Massachusetts, in the meantime, will row itself across the river. The 20th Massachusetts, known as the Bloody 20th or the Harvard Regiment, they look and see that the engineers have actually finished the bridges because the Union infantry have kept the Confederates at bay and kept their attention. So the engineers start to build these bridges. Bridges are finished. For whatever reason, the 20th Massachusetts want to make a flashy interest, and then they row themselves across. They row themselves across, they deploy about 307 men for action, and they push up, and they meet Thomas Hunt, the major of the 7th Michigan Infantry. And there's going to be a small debate on what to do next. He is going to, clear this off, meaning Hunt, he doesn't want to move forward. He is going to try and just sit where he is. He's in this beautifully ensconced spot behind a small wall. His men did their job. They've established a bridgehead. So why am I going to move forward deeper into the city, into an enemy of unknown strength and disposition? Up comes on the left-hand side of our screen, George Macy, the acting major of the 20th Massachusetts, and then Henry Abbott, who left us a great series of letters. Abbott is in charge of Company I, 20th Massachusetts Infantry. Macy is going to talk with Hunt in front of all the Confederates. The Confederates can hear what's going on. The two men are debating on what they should do. They send word back across the river to ask their division commander, a guy named Oliver Otis Howard. His nickname is Uh-Oh Howard. It's not a positive nickname. Frank O'Reilly, I think, puts it best. He calls him the pious but vapid Oliver Otis Howard. Howard is a brave man to a fault, but dumb as a box of rocks at times. And instead of giving clear-cut orders on what to do, he sends forward a simple order of press ahead. Doesn't say who should press ahead, where they should go, what they should do. And so Hunt says, I outrank you, Macy. You're just an acting major. My guys are going to stay here. Macy, with the orders he feels he should press ahead with, says, all right, you can go to hell with your regiment. And Hunt will respond, no living man can go into that intersection and come out alive, meaning the Hawk Street, Caroline Street intersection, which is the intersection here where you see the number 17. The Union soldiers, 7th Michigan, will come to ground here. The 19th Massachusetts will roughly be here. And the 20th Massachusetts is going to come into the town. They're going to enter the Hawk Street, Caroline Street intersection and lose 97 men. They're going to lose 1/3 of their men in this intersection. It's the bloodiest intersection in Fredericksburg. The Confederates have set up resistance points. They know that the Union Army is coming. They can hear them fighting in amongst themselves. And the Confederates have set up in the second-story floors of many of the homes and businesses. You need high ground at battle. What do they establish high ground in? Here in a cityscape, you go into the upper floors of a building. That's what I showed you here at the beginning of our talk. So that is what's going to happen. Some of the men will push farther into the town, while others are going to just seal off this intersection, stand there as a stationary target, and fire back at the Confederates. Now, in the meantime, Burnside will send more men across at a place called the Middle Crossing. Middle Crossing is where George Washington's Ferry Farm once stood. That's his family farm. They ran a ferry here across the Rappahannock River. And the 89th in New York will be sent across down here. Harrison Fairchild's regiment. As they come across, these guys will come into the city and just kind of hang out at the city wharves. You can see them down here at the bottom of our map. 89th New York, they will engage with elements of the 18th Mississippi as well as some of the 8th Florida, but not really. The 8th Florida, who show up late. You can see these Floridians at the north end of our town and the south end of our town. These Floridians, about 150 of them, wanted nothing to do with Barksdale's fight. And Barksdale really didn't want anything to do with them. He doesn't give them a good position to be in. They're actually in open fields. And to the north, the 8th Florida will lose their commander, Captain David Lang, who's buried underneath a bunch of rubble when an artillery shell comes crashing in and buries him. And about half of a company will pick this guy up and rush him off the field. That's the fastest way to get off the battlefield. To the south end of the town, elements of the 21st and 18th Mississippi will be firing on the middle pontoon crossing, trying to slow down these Union soldiers. And the 8th Florida, who's down here, commanded by a guy named William Baya, they'll scream to him, hey, fire. And he says, nope. They'll say, fire. Why don't you fire? Baya has figured something out. And the fact is, if you fire at a Yankee will return fire. If you don't fire at him, they won't fire at you. So he stays down there, and it's their status quo. The Mississippians abandon the 8th Florida, or at least that contingent of it, and most of them are captured as the Union Army comes across the middle pontoon crossing. This is what the aerial crossing looks like. This was the area of the wharves, the docks here at Fredericksburg here in 1862. This is what it would have looked like. Now, this is Rocky Lane. This is the oldest road in Fredericksburg. The portion of Andrew Govan's Mississippians would have charged down here, gone to the riverbank, fired on the Federals, and then fallen back up into the city. And this will be the road that carries much of the Union Army, about 30,000 Union soldiers up into the city here on December the 11th, 12th, and 13th. The famed Irish Brigade will march up this road as they enter Fredericksburg in December of 1862. After a while, William Barksdale will get orders to fall back. And to bring our story to a close, Barksdale will have defended the city until about darkness. He doesn't want to stay until dark because he's that obstinate. He wants to stay till dark so that he can give his men cover of darkness to cross those 900 yards of open fields back to Maurice Heights and back to the safety of the Confederate line of about 78,000 Confederates. The city will start to catch fire. due to the bombardment of the Union soldiers. Some Pennsylvania soldiers come across from the Philadelphia Brigade. They're former firefighters, and they actually help to try to put the fires out. But more of the soldiers will do damage than the artillery, and the city will start to feel the wrath of the Union Army. The Union Army of the Potomac had been within about 6 miles of Richmond in June of 1862. Then they were pushed all the way back to the gates of Washington, D.C. They lost battle after battle, and really they could have won many of them, but it was George McClellan who failed them time and time again. They lost their beloved George McClellan, and now they had watched on the banks of the Rappahannock River as their friends were slaughtered, going across in boats, and then fighting street by street. The Army of the Potomac unleashed its wrath upon the city of Fredericksburg in December 11th and 12th of 1862. Marcina Patrick, the military provost marshal of the Army, we think of him as military police today, rides across into the city and starts screaming that this is not an army, it's a rabble, and tries to get them into order. Men are taking everything they can. They're stuffed alligators they're taking out. They're breaking mirrors. They're wearing women's dresses. They're really just having a bacchanalia, because they know what's coming next, the Battle of Fredericksburg. They'll never know, of course, just how bad it will get, but they know that it's only going to get very ugly. Now, some of the houses were protected. Union officers will go into them and protect the homes. The man on the left-hand side is a Pennsylvania soldier named Alfred Sully. Sully, his father, Thomas, was a painter. And he's going to enter a home, and the soldier's going to start pointing at some paintings and say, wow, I wonder who that child is. And Sully's going to turn to the soldier and say, that's me. He entered actually one of his sister's homes. He had like 7 sisters and 3 half-sisters, and enters the home, protects the home, and protects his father's paintings. Oliver Otis Howard will do the same thing. He'll protect the Gordon house, but he will lose a pie that was made for him and set on a windowsill, and some Pennsylvania soldiers stole that from him. But the city of Fredericksburg will be looted, and it will be just the wrath of the Union Army unleashed upon the city of Fredericksburg. And this is what Fredericksburg will look like in 1864. This is not only the Union Army's bombardment, this is the Confederate bombardment in the following days. 2 battles took place here. And if you want to know where the bombardment of Fredericksburg really hit home, about 10% of the city was destroyed during the bombardment. If you ride along Caroline Street, you'll enter Caroline Street on the lower end, and you'll see colonial era homes. Then you get about halfway up and you'll see buildings from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Then you get to the north end of town and you'll again see these colonial era homes. Those 1930s, 40s, 50s buildings, that is where the core of the bombardment took place. It will take until the 1950s for Fredericksburg to economically recover from this war, and it will take about to the 1960s to regain its wartime Civil War population into Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania County. This area around Fredericksburg is just ravaged by the Civil War, and more than 100,000 soldiers will become casualties in the 4 major battles and the subsequent smaller battles that took place around Fredericksburg. And this is what a typical house would look like along Lower Caroline Street. This house is there still today, these houses, just made into what looks like Swiss cheese due to the bombardment. This is Liberty Town. This was the free African-American section of the city. This end of town is where the Union Army marches out of on December the 13th, as well as on May 3rd of 1863 for the Second Battle of Fredericksburg. And a lot of this damage over here was done by Confederate artillery who's firing at the Union Army coming out of the city. So the Union Army destroys about 3 blocks of the city, while the Confederates help to destroy about 2 blocks of the city. And that's the unfortunate nature of this town being caught in the middle. And to wrap up, the delay will cost Burnside an entire day. Burnside wanted to move across on the 11th, make assaults on the 12th. Now he has to move across on the 12th, make assaults on the 13th. And this will turn into basically a debacle. 13,000 or so Union soldiers will become casualties at the battle, where around 5,000 Confederates will. To put it into perspective, for the street fighting at Fredericksburg, Barksdale will suffer about 252 casualties during the battle, while the Union Army coming across will lose about 330 men. That's in about 10 hours of fighting. To put that into perspective, in that 10 hours of fighting, there were more than almost 600 men killed, wounded, or missing during that battle. The Battle of Second Fallujah in 2004 saw extensive street fighting by the U.S. Army for 6 weeks, and 655 men were killed, wounded in that battle. So it shows the intensity and the ferocity of these men as they're making up what they have to do as they go. One man to, I'll close off by reading a quote from a man of the 23rd North Carolina. He said, "Such a scene of destruction and desolation has scarcely ever been witnessed in any country. I rode through the streets and all was still as death. Nothing meeting the eye but destruction and ruin on all sides. The shot and shell rained upon the unhappy city with a rapidity and fury which the world has never surpassed. They flew through all parts of the town, striking houses, trees, steeples, walls, crashing through buildings of every kind, bursting inside of rooms and tearing their contents into fragments and doing a deal of damage surpassing anything that I imagined. One house alone had 132 cannonballs pass through it, each one tearing and crashing the timbers where it went." And that's, unfortunately for the city of Fredericksburg, the story of the river crossing at Fredericksburg. I'll take just a couple questions here because I want to wrap up for everyone. I went a couple minutes late, as I usually do. So let me just see what we have here. Take a look here. Let's see. That one's way too long to ask. Let's see what we have over here. Was anyone from the local Mercer Patton family involved in these battles? I couldn't answer that off the top of my head. I know that the Mercer family has guys out west, and Pattons are fighting out in the Western Theater of the Virginia. So I can't say that any ones were at the Battle of Fredericksburg. I do know that they were in other parts of the Confederacy fighting at that point. What house did Sully save? I can't remember it off the top of my head. I do know it. I just can't remember it. Let's see. What else do we have here? A couple over here in the chat. Let's see. That's all we have over there. And I'm just reading one here that's quite long. Why didn't Burnside cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan fords on the west of Fredericksburg and then either attack Longstreet or advance on the city from the west? Simply put, this is the very simple answer to a very complex question. Why doesn't Burnside cross the river? Simply due to weather. He has to make a military crossing. Yes, there are river fords there, but his biggest problem is Mother Nature. It's going to rain, it's going to snow throughout this campaign, it's going to raise the level of the river, and that is going to potentially strand one half of your army on the enemy side and one half on another side, and there's nothing that they can do. So Burnside also needs to get artillery, wagons, men, horses across. He wants to make a military crossing. Go back to Antietam. Why does he focus on the bridge? He needs to make a military crossing. Crossing down at Boatler's Ford is not going to do him any good with the steep banks. He has to get his wagons, his artillery, everything else to keep that drive going forward. Does he become hyper-focused on the bridge? Absolutely. But he needs it to make a military crossing. Let's see. Can you compare the lower crossing to what you described regarding the upper and middle crossings? Very easy. Lower crossing, Union Army's across in just a few hours. The lower crossing is 2 miles south of the city. That is defended by John Bell Hood's men. Down in that sector, specifically Jerome Robinson's Texas Brigade. They don't have the cover and concealment that Barksdale has. And by early afternoon, 2 bridges have been laid south of the city. And in fact, Burnside could have started crossing men south of the city to outflank the Confederates in the city of Fredericksburg. He chooses not to. He chooses to focus on those bridges to the detriment of the rest of the Union Army. He waits for the upper and the middle bridges to be completed, and then he starts crossing his men across. Down on the south side, down at the lower crossing, a place called the Bend, also called Franklin's Crossing today, because that's where William Franklin's men crossed. You would have United States sharpshooters, Pennsylvania bucktails, you would have Texas Brigade, artillery, and it's a very easy cakewalk compared to what the Union Army dealt with in the city of Fredericksburg. Why did Gettysburg escape this fate? It's not really caught like this would be in the middle of two armies for 2 weeks in a prepared position. That's the larger, most of the fighting took place outside of the city. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for watching today. If you want to, head over to battlefields.org. You can learn more about the Battle of Fredericksburg. You can see some of the maps that I used in this presentation. You can also check out our slaughter pen farm. That's 208 acres that we saved back now almost 15 years ago, I think it is. I think it's 15 years now that we saved just south of the city. It's the last open attack plane at Fredericksburg, very close to Franklin's Crossing, close to the lower crossing down there. And if you're interested in the Maurice Heights fight, you can check out our animated map as well as our static maps that we have, as well as all of our great information from our Fredericksburg Facebook Live about 5 years ago that we did with a whole gaggle of historians down in Fredericksburg. You can go over to Facebook and check